Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the NADTC webinar on Pedestrian Connections, Planning for the Walkability Needs of Older Adults and People with Disabilities from Current Conditions to a Future with Automated Vehicles. We're very happy that you were able to join us today. A few housekeeping items that we're going to get out of the way before we get started. We are recording the webinar today, and the recorded webinar as well as presentation materials will be posted to the NADTC website within a few days as soon as we're able to get that ready. If you are connected both by phone and internet, this is a great time to go ahead and mute your computer speakers. If you have not already experienced feedback, you will eventually experience that, having both of those going at the same time. So please do go ahead and mute your computer speakers to eliminate that feedback. If you are on the phone but having trouble joining the Blackboard webinar room, you have two options for technical assistance. You can contact the Blackboard Technical Assistance line at 877-382-2293. Or you can email me, Christy McLaughlin, at mclaughlin@gmail.com. And that's McLaughlin, so McLaughlin and McLaughlin@gmail.com. And we'll get you connected. And just a reminder, though, you do not have to be connected to the webinar room. We did email the presentation to all of the registered participants about 45 minutes ago. You can print that out and participate just by calling in on the phone if you'd like to do that. You're not going to lose any functionality by participating that way versus being connected to the webinar room. Next, we will have a question and answer session during the webinar at the end of the webinar today. You don't have to wait to the end of the webinar. You can submit your questions or comments at any time, either by entering them into the chat box, which is the lower left side of your screen in the webinar room, or by sending an email with your question or comment to Rachel Byerly at rbyerly@easterseals.com, and that's RBYERLE@easterseals.com. Finally, captioning is provided for the webinar today. You can access the captioning by either pressing Control and F8 on your keyboard or by clicking on the CC icon that is the top left of your screen. When you do this, a separate screen will pop up for you to resize however you'd like, and you can set the font and type size to your liking as well. So with that, I'm not going to make you wait any longer, and I'm going to turn the session over to Rachel to get us started. Rachel?
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time zone you're calling from. And again, welcome to the NADTC Pedestrian Connections webinar. As Christy said, my name is Rachel Byerly, and I'm Communications Director for NADTC. And today we're excited to welcome our guest speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Meg Tracy, who is a Research Associate Professor at the University of Montana, and who is also representing the work of the Montana Disability and Health Program and the Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities. And we have two speakers from the Pedestrian Bicycle Information Center. They are Dr. Laura Sant, Director of the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety and also Director of the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, and Dr. Michael Kleiman, who is Senior Human Factors Engineer at the Highway Safety Research Center, and both of those are located at the University of North Carolina. And our presenters will share a little bit more about their roles and their work during their presentation. And before we move on to those presentations, I just wanted to provide a brief overview on the NADTC. We are a U.S. Department of Transportation Technical Assistance Center, and we receive our funding through the Federal Transit Administration with guidance from the Administration for Community Living, which is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We're co-hosted by Easter Seals and the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, which you may know as N4A, their acronym. And our mission at NADTC is to promote the availability and accessibility of transportation options for older adults and people with disabilities, as well as caregivers. And we do this by providing technical assistance through information and referral. We have a toll-free 800 line, or you can also email us questions if you have them. We also provide training and education such as this webinar, communication and outreach. We have a monthly e-newsletter, and if you're not subscribed, you can do that via our website. And we also provide community grants. We'll be sending out an announcement this afternoon about our 2018 grantee communities. In terms of pedestrian topics, pedestrian accessibility is just one of several areas we focus on within the realm of accessibility and livability. And we particularly want to emphasize the importance of walkability to public transportation, especially for older adults and people with disabilities. But really, we want to focus on accessibility for all. And pedestrian-related resources we offer include the Accessible Pathways Guide, the Access to Transit Assessment Tool, the Driver and Pedestrian Safety Guide. We also have a Neighborhood Wayfinding Guide and Assessment Form. And if any of our listeners today are participating in our Accessible Pedestrian Pathways online course, you're familiar with that guide because you have used that for your walkability audit as part of the course. And we also have a snow removal guide if you live in regions of the country where this is an important issue. In the past, we've participated in some pedestrian-related Twitter chats, and you can find archives from an April 2017 chat and a more recent February 2018 chat that we participated in. And all of these resources that I just mentioned are available on our website, which is NADTC.org. And that provides you just a brief introduction to what we do related to pedestrian accessibility at NADTC. And with that as background, I'm going to turn it over to Meg Tracy, who is our first presenter from the University of Montana.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm really happy to be a part of the conversation today. I'm representing the work that we're doing here in Montana on an inclusive interdisciplinary approach to making walkable communities. There's lots of folks to acknowledge. These are some. We had some funding from the National Association of Chronic Disease Directors. Kathy Kastakis and I organized with our partners for that opportunity, and we're lucky enough to have Karma Harris from NACDD as our project officer working in the communities of Helena and Butte and at the state level. We have terrific partner coaches in both those communities, Karen Lane and Scott Birkenbuell, representing public health and a Center for Independent Living, as well as Karen Sullivan and Todd Hoare representing public health, as well as the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council in Butte-Silver Boat County and the ADA coordinator position. Mark Fenton, who's a national walkability advocate, is also a partner. I'd like to recognize. Many of the success stories from that NACDD grant are available on the CDC website at that link that I've provided on the slide. We wouldn't be doing this work without our Centers for Independent Living. We're very lucky to have really strong CILs in Montana, Summit Independent Living Center, Montana Independent Living Project, Living Independently for Today and Tomorrow, and North Central Independent Living Services. The Montana Disability and Health Program organizes our programs with these centers, and one of our programs is Disability Advisors, where we recruit, train, and support disability leaders to be on our public health planning committees for the Building Active Communities initiatives. Lizanne Kudra and Chris Diller have been playing the disability advisor role for several years now. We also have a program of accessibility ambassadors that organizes CIL staff and peers statewide to work on improving sector accessibility, particularly those sectors that are part of the health determinant networks and assets in our communities. And these are some of the folks who have been really involved in the Ambassadors Project and walking audits the last couple of years with us. The Healthy Communities Coalitions and Baki action teams have been integral throughout the state, and I want to acknowledge Bike Walk Montana and Melinda Barnes and her leadership, as well as Bike Walk Helena, the Montana Department of Transportation, and many others. So lots of folks working together to make our communities more walkable in Montana. Let's see. This is a slide, a map of the Research and Training Center on Disability in Rural Communities here at the University of Montana Rural Institute for Inclusive Communities. My colleague Lily Griman developed this map with ACS data from the 2012 to 2016 5-year sample. And I've included it here just to represent that people with disabilities live everywhere. And in some of our counties, the rate of in the population is as high as 37%, and it ranges quite a bit. But in rural America, we tend to see higher rates of disability. I include that because when we think about what makes a walkable community, it's really important from our perspective that persons with disabilities have a part of the answer, and they're in all communities everywhere. And how we engage the disability community in our work is really important. I've included this slide, which is a famous disability civil rights Tom Olin photo featuring leaders like Justin Dart and Judy Human, to say that this work is really a continuation of that movement. The walkability of communities for all Americans depends on the solutions of all its members, including people with disabilities. And one more slide to drive that home, who's meeting at a confluence. This is the Blackfoot River on the left, meeting with the Clark Fork River on the right, with I-90 running through on the background just east of Missoula, where I live here in Montana. It's Healthy Communities, if that's the Blackfoot River, meeting the independent living movement at this confluence. We're going to have a rich set of solutions to building walkable communities for all. And this is really a way to represent universal design. We're not doing this work simply because we want people with disabilities to be included, be a part of the reach. We want communities to be better because people with disabilities have a sensitivity and a focus and solutions that are beneficial to all. And I've included a link there if you're interested more in universal design. So this is the train I took from Chicago over 25 years ago to Montana, the Empire Builder. And I included it here as an illustration of how do we make communities walkable? What's the rationale? How are we including people with disabilities to drive us past our current boundaries? I would argue that a lot of our work in walkable communities builds the rationale of comfort. We're increasing comfort in our communities, social capital, economic vitality. We started to build out and talk about health, obviously safety and welfare. But by including people with disabilities, we really are strengthening our engines, these three engines. We're able to go the distance by adding dignity, equity, freedom, and independence. That's why we make communities walkable. And I just included a little resource of the myth of average. It's a TEDx talk by Todd Rose that I think helps to make this point a little further. One last slide about thoughts about inclusion in walkable communities. It's about environmental attributes that connect people with disabilities to their community, to social life, jobs, healthy eating and physical activity opportunities. It's about what we know works, like PROAG, public rights of way accessibility guidelines. But it's also about putting people in leadership roles so that we can imagine more. On the left is, again, another photo from Tom Olin. This is the 1988 action where people took hammers to the curbs of the Hollywood Walk of Fame. This is radical tactile urbanism. Some of the first curb cuts being imagined there. And on the right is a pedestrian bridge over Highway 93, which goes north from Missoula all the way up around Flathead Lake. This is just outside Pablo on the Flathead Indian Reservation. And this is, again, nobody could imagine this until we really involve the whole community. But you can see this is a nice, accessible pedestrian ramp that also reflects the cultural values of that community. So from the public health perspective, why do we do this? It's important to keep in mind the range of health disparities experienced by people with disabilities that are can be addressed through environmental interventions. I've included some results from the Montana BRFSS, Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which is one of our public health data systems. And we can see from the 2015 data where we had up the hypertension question that nearly twice as many adults with disabilities experience hypertension compared to those without disabilities. So if we're trying to meet the HP 2020 goal to reduce to 27% the proportion of adults with hypertension, we have to take this equitable approach. We have to be thinking with the disability community about solutions. One more thought about inclusion is it is about partnerships, but it is also about leadership. So it's important to have the diversity in your partnership to include disability representatives. So you've built a table. On the left here, this picnic table, and you've invited disability representatives. But you really are doing this because at the end of the day, you want to fulfill leadership roles on the inclusion of people with disabilities in walkable communities. At some point, this table has got to be accessible. And that's because the person who's bought the table is somebody who has that lived experience or somebody who's involved in spending those dollars is saying, these are the tables we're going to buy moving forward. This is a screenshot from America Walks website, just showing that they have these memorandum of understandings with a variety of national organizations, including the National Council on Independent Living. So they're organizing for partnerships and leadership to do more inclusive work. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Council on Independent Living, I've included a screenshot here from their website, and other organizations that America Walks is partnered with, the National Center on Health, Physical Activity and Disability, NICPAD, and other disability organizations. But they're really trying to take an inclusive approach to building out their resources and support for more walkable communities. NICL is comprised of Centers for Independent Living, and for those of you who aren't familiar with CILs, they exist in every state. There's over 400, and this map again is from the RTC Rural, and it shows just the range and density of CILs. They cover, in Montana, our Centers for Independent Living cover every county. They provide service throughout the state. To find a CIL in your area, I've included the website for the ILRU directory. And this arrow just shows, again, those 4 centers I acknowledged at the beginning. Again, Lewis and Clark Public Health, Silverbow Public Health and Developmental Disabilities Council are part of some of the work I'm going to talk about today. The important thing is when you think about a CIL, their core services can be leveraged to this work. They're doing community outreach and they're building advocacy, and a lot of that can help you to focus a partnership in a way on projects, policy, and other planning opportunities to realize inclusive outcomes. And on this slide, I again want to acknowledge Mark Fetton for all of his help in thinking about how to bring CILs into leadership roles in this work. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about our walk audit model that Mark has offered to us and is working with us to implement throughout the state in a more inclusive, interdisciplinary way. If you haven't been on a walk audit, it's a facilitated group walk of an area to explore support of physical activity, active transportation, and healthy food access. It's usually held as part of a workshop with introductory and planning sessions to develop recommendations for action. And it's an effective tool for education, inspiration, and practical planning. And Mark really talks about this as an act of shared discovery. It's a lot of fun. In this slide, there are some pictures that Mark has shared with us from Louisville, Kentucky, where there was some pedestrian planning going on. And these were inclusive walks. But in a little bit different way than we're going to talk about today, I think. So when do you do a walk audit? I mentioned you do this as a comprehensive and project planning public input component. It's part of reviewing your policy for zoning, design, guidelines in schools, when you're introducing infrastructure such as roundabouts, road diets, back-in parking, trails, etc. And when you're thinking about events, what are the big public events where the infrastructure is being leveraged to be hopefully inclusive? Take a look by doing a walk audit. if you're going to do walk and bike to school or work or pop-ups or open streets and the like. These photos are, again, Mark Fenton's photos from different work he's done throughout the country using walk audit and workshop models. So when we think about what's different about the usual walk audit and what we were trying to do in Montana and elsewhere is at the heart of the I2 walk is a trained interdisciplinary team that represents 4 entities. When we first started working with Mark, it was these first 3, and then he said, let's really solidify this leadership within this model. So the first 3 were public health, someone representing land use and planning, someone representing engineering or the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, and a disability expert, defining disability as a dynamic interaction between a person and the environment. What makes the I2 Walk interdisciplinary teams inclusive? A little bit more about who is on this planning team, who is leading these walks, this 4-person at least team. These are people with disabilities who are decision makers in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of the walking audit. These team members have training in the Americans with Disabilities Act, orientation and mobility, and or related codes and guidelines to provide technical assistance on healthy community solutions for all. In this picture, we've got photographs from the inaugural workshop where Mark really was working with the Greater Helena Area Healthy Communities Coalition and some of our ambassadors from around the state to do the first walk audits that were inclusive, interdisciplinary, planned with the disability community on that team. And you can see Chris Filler's picture here, Mark Sanders, Lizanne Kudrak, Karen Lane, others walking around Helena. So this is a little model I've included. It's not easy doing these walk audits. You don't just show up and walk, right? You just don't call this team. And it's a lot of work for the team, and we're beginning to describe that in our tools and through experiences with our Centers for Independent Living and community partners in Montana. We're thinking at least 1 month in advance of the workshop, the inclusive interdisciplinary team prepares to facilitate the workshop. It's a 3 to 4 hour workshop. There's an introductory session that needs to be planned. There's a PowerPoint slide presentation that Mark has given to us and that we've been working on to make a template for the variety of different occasions that our partners are using the walk audit model for. And so that whole slide set is really tailored for what the occasion is, what the community is, and what the desired outcomes of the walk are. And then you plan the facilitated group walk. That's the area with an interdisciplinary group of stakeholders. They're going out and they're really looking at the targets. We have some checklists I'll talk about in a minute. And then the final session is probably the most important session where people come back and say, what did you see? What happened? And we do some action planning, and we really are thinking about the 3 Ps of programs, projects, and policies, who's going to do what and when. And then there's the short and long-term follow-up that's an important part of doing this kind of work. Preparing for the I2 walk. So we want to identify the workshop location, and it has to be an accessible meeting space. We want to scout the route with the team. We're going to choose the locations. There are targets on the route we want to identify as a team. We're using this new I2 Walk targets checklist to gather team notes from this interdisciplinary and inclusive perspective. Everybody's got a different view of the target and why it's good and why it's bad. We want to get those notes together for whoever's going to be facilitating. We want to make sure to be inclusive that when we have a route for people to walk, we're also including text descriptions. It's not just a map that we hand out. We want people who are blind to be on our walk, and so we are going to provide the information in a way that meets that expectation. Identify significant barriers. We're going to plan for alternative transportation. We just don't know what's going to happen, and so we want to make sure people can get back for that action planning session. And it may be a windy day, and it may affect people's eye gaze technology. It may, somebody's battery may run out on their powered wheelchair. There might be a variety of reasons that someone with a disability may need to go back, so you plan for the alternate transportation, and guess what? When you do that, others want to use it too because they have to get back for a call or for a variety of reasons. We also plan for shorter alternate routes for a lot of folks who may be deconditioned, they've been sick. It allows them to spend a little bit of time in the same area, but with a little more focus on some of the targets and really getting at some of the details of environmental design for providing access to those assets. These targets include schools, public transportation, bike shelters, trails, greenway facilities, open space and recreational areas, a diversity of residential developments, retail, commercial settings, diversity of sidewalks, marked as the good, the bad, and the ugly, curb cuts and amenities, and at least one safe and accessible intersection. We're looking for inclusion attributes. We want to see curb cuts. We want to put accessible surfacing of trails somewhere on this walk if possible. We want to, if there's a playground, we want to at least be able to talk about riverized surfacing and accessible entrances to businesses and other buildings and transportation shelters. What does that look like for accessibility? These are all the kinds of things that we're hoping to highlight and have conversations about on the walk audit and then be a part of our action planning. This is a slide that Mark uses. Again, this interdisciplinary approach is going to leverage all these perspectives to the conversation. So as you're planning and as you're holding the walk, you're going to have people who are thinking about sections of the route from a land use perspective. Is there a mix of destinations? Do I want to go here? And we're looking at how things are connected, this network of facilities. Can I bike there? Can I walk there? Is there public transportation? I'm looking at the site design. Is this a place I want to go? And finally, we're looking at the safety and basic standard accessibility of features that reduce injuries and fatalities. And as we're doing this work, we're seeing, that the inclusive approach, the disability community is bringing perspectives to all four of these. For example, with land use, if we were looking for accessible housing development, and people point to the senior or physically disabled housing unit, the housing unit for people with physical disabilities, oftentimes it's so isolated. It's not connected to anything, and it's really hard to build the route to include that unit. So it's really nice to be able to find affordable housing that is at least visitable and has some universal design elements that within these dense mixed use of destinations and comfortable, enjoyable places, and is connected in safe and accessible ways. Lots of photos on this slide illustrating these four areas or four elements for active design. Preparing to conduct the walk audit, I mentioned how we want to revise the presentation and tailor it for the event. It's really important with the team to think about evaluation, how much or how little can we do and should we do. It's important to think about the team roles. Preferably, you want to do that before the workshop with an in-person planning meeting. Who really can at least pretend to be someone as high energy as Mark Fenton for the walk audit and keep people moving and keep the conversation going and not getting too bogged down in the details? And how can the team then on the walk be supportive of that lead person? That's really important to think through and to plan for. And then we've got to send the participants invitation and agenda with the route information and sign in participants and offer those photo release forms. The photos are so important for the action planning that we want to make sure we can use them. And then how we're going to conduct the workshop and then how we're going to follow up. All that is important to do. Some of the evaluation we did with the Helena inaugural event led to some write-in open-ended responses to some of the questions when people were asked about what they would commit to after the event, they were going to do more of these I2Walk events with community partners, and that certainly has happened in Helena, some really nice outcomes and continued walks in Helena. Accessible meetings and communications. People are going to be educating their colleagues, families, and friends on what they learned about accessibility and inclusion. People said things like, I'll never be able to look at my community the same way again. Inclusive built environment improvements to improve public health, and strengthening policy to assure accessible and inclusive outcomes. Just really quickly with my last couple minutes, I just want to show this is the route, and there's some text descriptions for a short route. This is an introductory walk audit route that we've developed in Helena, our partners in Helena put together, and it takes about an hour to meet with everybody and to walk this route and provide some accessible alternative transportation back to the start. And then people understand what it's about, and they're willing to engage their organization in the whole workshop. So you're going to see some photos from the winter from when Helena did this walk with Leadership Helena, which is a businesses and organizations focused. This is a committee of that group focused on health. So this is Helena, Montana in the winter, and that comes with its own challenges. So I'm excited to hear about NADTC's resource on snow shoveling and recommendations. But these are the kinds of things that we planned for and wanted this group to see. And just some more photos of how the snow builds up on those curb cuts and how the streets are icy and snowy, and the connectivity is really affected by the snow in ways that can be isolating or dangerous for people with disabilities. Sorry, go back one more. There's the snow, the importance of snow shoveling. And if we do this, I've been a part of doing this walk with the Helena partners in the summer, and it allows us to look at some of the other challenges for walking for the Helena community when there isn't snow. So this is just that added layer that we were able to look at. This is Helena. You should visit. It's gorgeous. And you can kind of see the sleeping giant in the background, his big nose sticking up there. Not always gray and snowy. These are some photos I included from some recent planning I'm doing with Missoula partners, where we're trying to establish a route like the one in Helena, where we can train team leaders as well as do introductory walks. This is Travis Hoffman from Summit Independent Living Center, and Chris Sillins is an orientation mobility specialist. I included this photo to emphasize, if you can, having advocates represent both experiences. People with who are blind and low vision, they have a whole different set of solutions for building out walkable communities, and as do people who use power wheelchairs and manual wheelchairs. So, and there's obviously shared solutions, but each comes with their own perspective on the environment and ways to improve it. These are some of the examples from the walk that we were putting together in Missoula, just trying to get into building. There's some plan for accessibility, but not for maintenance. That door is pretty narrow. Here's, 2018, and this is right downtown Missoula. We still don't have curb cuts at our intersections. And we build out beautiful parking. And just as an example for how the walk audit would go, some people might say, oh, we really like this section of the block because look how wide the sidewalks are, and there's a tree, and there's lots of places to go. But the accessible parking is set up so that when you open your van, the ramp goes into the tree. So it's bringing people together. We also like the bike block area. I mean, it's nice, but it's just that one. If we could have everybody thinking about this ahead of time, that would be better. That's me. That's all I have time to say. We did include some resources for you on this contact page. including on that last website, there's a webinar that Mark Benton did for us on this model. Thanks. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Meg. We're going to take questions at the end. You can go ahead and post your questions in the chat box or email your questions if you have those already in mind, but we are going to have a dedicated question and answer session at the end. So right now we'll turn it over to Laura and Michael.
Thank you so much. And so again, I'm Laura Stott with UNC's Highway Safety Research Center. And my focus for the past 15 years here has been on pedestrian and bicycle safety and improvement. My background is in planning and public health, and I'm joined here by Michael Klahman, who is a senior human factors engineer. He has recently joined HSRC from Duke's Human and Autonomy Lab, but he's been working on automation and technology for many, many years now, and he's our resident expert. And so we're sort of turning this conversation towards the next chapter and what the future challenges with safety and mobility are going to be, and how we can be keeping a closer eye on some of the opportunities and challenges with vehicle automation. So if you've been closely following the news over the past couple of years, you can see that we are really in the midst of an arms race to see who can bring automated vehicles to market first. There is a lot of money being invested in making vehicles more highly automated, leaning towards self-driving. And a lot of this investment is due to bets on the potential payoff of this technology. Not just industry-level profits, but how automation can reduce some of the burdens of injuries that are experienced on our roadway by many different people. You may have heard a lot of crashes are attributed to vehicle behaviors, driver behaviors, and many of these could be taken off the table by improved automation that might reduce some of the mistakes that drivers make behind the wheel. We've also heard self-driving vehicles and automation being offered as a new solution for mobility, in particular people who have trouble getting to certain destinations but want to have more independent lifestyles. And there's also a lot of talk about how automated vehicles can help us reduce energy consumption and lead to more efficient use of our roadways and land use. But a lot of these potential benefits really require a lot of careful consideration in order for them to be realized and for the benefits to be shared by everyone who needs to use the road and not by the few. And one of the things that we've noticed as we've been examining the literature is that there really hasn't been enough attention paid to pedestrian issues and to the needs of people with different disabilities. The figure in this slide shows results from a 2017 study that looked at more than 400 published articles from around the world and looked at the topics that were being covered around automated vehicles. And so you can see near the top of the list is road safety, legal and regulatory issues, kind of market demand and public acceptance, but only about 20 studies were identified out of these 400 that talked about the interaction with pedestrians, and about the same number that talked about mobility for people with different disabilities. And very near the bottom of the list is the number of studies that looked at accessibility and overall physical activity. So this is something that the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center wanted to change, and to be able to support more of a discussion around automation as it relates to things that we really hold dear. And so the work of PPIC and our broader centers that we work in really recognize that people have a strong need to be able to walk or roll the bicycle so that they can not only be active, but that they can support their overall health, that they can reach their destinations safely, and more broadly to be socially connected and supported. We recognize that some road users are coping with different cognitive and spatial awareness deficits. Some road users have special mobility needs. They may have difficulty interacting with new technologies, or they may need very special assistive devices. We also recognize that many road users, particularly pedestrians and transit users, may have low or fixed incomes. And so we need to be mindful of the diverse range of road users' needs as we begin to plan safe, secure, comfortable, and affordable travel in the future. So in 2017, we produced the PPIC discussion guide for automated and connected vehicles, pedestrians and bicyclists. What we really tried to do was provide a common language for talking about challenges. We included a glossary of terms and some background literature, and then we highlighted actually 10 key areas in which automated vehicles in the future may be impacting road users outside the vehicle, mainly pedestrians and bicyclists and people with various disabilities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Michael. He's going to touch on a few of these that we felt were most salient for today's discussion. And certainly feel free to reference the full guide on our website. It is available off the homepage of pedbikeinfo.org.
Thank you, Laura. So as Laura was pointing out in her slides, there are a lot of promises for automated vehicles that have to do with mobility and safety, but despite some of the things that we read in the popular press, we're not quite there yet. There's still a number of different challenges that we have to overcome. But before I talk about some of the specific issues, I want to address the issue, what is an automated vehicle? Because there's some confusion over that. So what I have here is a slide that describes the SAE autonomous vehicle automated driving levels. And this is a list of 6 different levels that range from the lowest level, which is no automation. That's, your 68 Mustang, going all the way up to full automation, which is a car that can take you anywhere you want, requiring only limited interaction from you. These are cars with no gas pedal, no steering wheel. You just input a set of commands. So we're quite a long way before we get to that point, and what you see, what I have highlighted there or outlined in red over on the right, is that there's a number of these different intermediate levels which are getting past some of the wordy descriptions. It's really a question of who has responsibility for a few different tasks. So who is operating the wheels and the pedals, who's required to pay attention to the road, and then finally, who's responsible for responding to emergencies. And so what you can see, the implication here is that on the way to full autonomy, there's really a partnership between the automated vehicle and the human operator, at whatever level that may be. So really what the design of automation is not so much immediately this rush to make the vehicles full driving in the intermediate. It's really a partnership, and it's the development of a partnership that works for the human operator. So what you're seeing as you start to read articles about driverless cars and automated vehicles being on the road, what you're seeing is evidence of us still being at a testing stage. So because we're not there yet, for the foreseeable future, you're going to be seeing these cars on the road. And so there's a number of different ways that we can test automated vehicles that I've got listed here. I know there's the option for closed track testing, for doing structure testing on open roads, customers driving Teslas, and the possibility for doing simulated environments. But what we're seeing a lot of is this need for doing testing on our public roads. And this is what we see, that Waymo is so proud of, and, with a number of these other automated car companies, that's what they're doing. They have their engineers sitting behind the wheel of the car while they collect data. The reason why this is still necessary is because of something called corner cases. So if you want to see something that's unusual. If you want to fully understand real-world driving, you have to actually drive in the real world. Doing simulations, doing closed tracks gives you the ability to set up specific scenarios, but we can't learn what those scenarios need to look like until we actually see them on the public roads and identify those corner cases. Okay, so what is it they're actually testing? So if you look at our PPIC guide, you will see that there are a number of different challenges from a technical standpoint, and one of the main ones that we have to deal with is the detection problem. So how is it that we teach automated vehicles to see and understand their environment? And that's a huge technical hurdle. And there's two stages of this. There's the actual collection of the visual data, which is done through a number of sensors, which I have listed out here. But then there's the converting of that data into information that we can actually use. So if you have heard of driverless cars, being tested on the roads, we see cameras, we see these large spinning LiDARs on the tops of vehicles, there's radars, and then there's ultrasound. And each of these has their own strengths and limitations that they use. So what's typical in automated vehicles is that you're going to see something called sensor fusion, where you combine all these things together to make up for the strengths and limitations. So, for example, a camera is extremely inexpensive. That's why you see them on the majority of automated vehicles right now. They're the only type of detection device that can interpret color. But they're very data intensive, and they take a lot of processing power to work. LiDAR, in contrast, is much better at cameras at detecting shapes and even high resolution shapes. But they can be spoofed by rain, by snow, and they're not always effective. They're also extremely expensive and fairly large on the cars. So as you start to look at these different combinations, you see that you need to add additional sensors to make up for the limitations of the other one, to the point where if you're using all of them together, you do have a fairly rich picture of what's going on the road. Okay, but all of that, as I mentioned, that's just data collection. The real art to this is teaching computers how to see the same way that we do, and that means taking the visual information and actually processing it and turning it into something that they can use to make navigation decisions. Now, when a computer does this is very different than what we do as humans. The computer is going to be looking at its landscape. It's going to be separating images from the background to figure out what's relevant. It's going to segment them into different parts and then compare them to a lexicon of images. So essentially, what it's doing is what's called bottom-up processing, or figuring out a object by comparing it to something that it's already seen. And that's one of the other reasons why you see some of these vehicles driving all over the place collecting data, is it's trying to find new situations and new images to add to its databases that it can interpret. Now, in contrast, the way people interpret these is in what's called top-down processing. So we are very good at looking at something that we've never seen before and being able to conclude what it is. So, for example, people are really great at looking at other people, and it doesn't matter what shapes, what sizes they are, how old they are, what loads they might be carrying, the age, the gender, if they might have some kind of assisted mobility device. A person is going to have no problem being able to tell that that's a person. A computer, unfortunately, needs to be told that in advance. And we saw a fairly grim example of this back in March when the Uber vehicle struck the pedestrian lane in Hertzburg because she was pushing a bicycle that was loaded down with bags. And the Uber detection algorithm really struggled with that because it wasn't sure whether it should categorize it as a bicycle or a person. So needing to put into a category is one of the things that slowed down and caused that really terrible problem. Whereas a person would have looked at that and they've been able to pretty much immediately recognize what the issue was. Okay. So really to take home on this is for the time being, we're still looking at, in the transition, we're looking at a partnership where we're dividing responsibilities between a person and a vehicle until we can get to the point where the vehicle can operate on its own, where we need to continue to give the people responsibility for the high-level goals for pattern recognition, and the automation for doing things that are repetitive and tedious and need to be precise. And in that meantime, one of the things that also means is since we can't completely rely on autonomous vehicles to do its detection, it's very important that the vehicle have a means of communicating its intent to the people around it. So whether that's through some kind of sound communication, whether it's through visual communication, whether it's some kind of intentional sound signature that goes with the vehicle, then that's something that absolutely has to happen in the transition to make sure that everyone can understand exactly what's going on. So I'll turn it back over to Laura at this point.
So one of the questions we often get in these discussions is, what's going to happen to pedestrians in the future as more and more automated vehicles are entering our roadway system? And I really do love this quote from Paul Batalden, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And so the bottom line is, as researchers or practitioners or policymakers or stakeholders, we really need to be thinking about and defining the results that we want to see as more technologies become available, and then figuring out how those new technologies will help us get to where we want to go. So, as Michael pointed out, some of the challenges with the current technology and the testing that we're in, it's really important that we be mindful of the limits of this technology and that we continue to invest in complementary solutions. And Meg did a really nice job of giving some of the rationale and the processes to help build walkable environments. But walkable environments with supportive land uses and universal design, placemaking for social inclusion, are all critical pieces of the transportation system of the future. And we have to remember, too, that some of the design principles that support human drivers will also be really helpful to automated vehicles. By defining clear boundaries on the roadway, designating or separating spaces, by having clear lines of sight between the pedestrians and the vehicle, and improved lighting for detection. Those are all things that will help drivers now as well as more automated technologies in the future. And I think it's also important that we continue remembering that machines will never be able to replace some of the human-to-human interactions that support travel and that some seniors, and particularly people with disabilities, may need. And so there will always be a need for transit, for paratransit, and some of the other supportive services that we provide. But one really nice example I like to call attention to is from Portland, their Smart Automated Vehicles initiative that's also connected to their Smart City Portland initiative. It's really a nice model where it's a community that's putting people first in thinking through their data and technology investments. And there's many other cities, Seattle and Boston both come to mind, that have really expressed their core principles and developed a framework on how automated vehicle technologies can serve the needs of their communities, with particular emphasis on traditionally underserved communities, including people of color and people with disabilities. And one of the things that we see in those plans is that they're really working on trying to define and test what the appropriate role of automated vehicles is and how these new technologies fit into their systems. And early partnerships is a key to that, in particular at the design stage, when important decisions are being made about the technology display, the design, how accessible it can be for users and caregivers. And even thinking through the availability of the technology for end users. Those are all considerations that the earlier we make in the design and development process, the more likely we are to achieve the benefits in the long term. So we're seeing nice examples where communities are working with transit and with other partners to really invest in partnerships and pilot testing some of these. And I think many of the coalitions that Meg mentioned with the Centers for Independent Living and other groups are really vital for collaborating in the space with the technology developers as well. So I think we wanted to close with that note. There are certainly many other resources that you can find on this topic under the pedbikeinfo.org website. And we'd be happy to answer any questions in the remaining time, or we can follow up as needed as well.
All right, thank you so much. Laura and Michael, I'm going to ask you, you had a little bit of issue with your audio. It was getting a little crackly. It got better, and so we didn't stop you, but if you could just hang up and call back in. I'm going to give some instructions on how everybody can ask their questions. You've got time to do that before you'll be asked any questions. So just to try to make that, see if we can get rid of it altogether, just hang up and dial back in, and I'll be giving instructions while you do that. So.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both, Laura and Michael, and Meg, for the great presentations. A lot of really good information. Just a reminder, you do have a couple of ways to ask questions or make comments. You can either type your question into the chat box, which is at the left bottom of your screen if you are in the webinar room, or you can email your questions to Byerly@easterseals.com. That's RBEYERLE@easterseals.com. And we have a couple of additional slides just to give people the time to ask their questions and to get some things typed into the chat box that I'm going to go ahead and talk about really quickly here. We thank you so much for your participation. After the session today, we are going to email a session evaluation. You don't have to write down this link right now. You'll get that via email if you're a registered participant. And we do ask that you give us your feedback. It's just a very short survey, and it helps us to improve future sessions. So with that, I am going to go back to the questions. I want to see really quickly if Laura and Michael are back with us.
We are
Laura
back,
and Michael.
Calling in on a different line. Can you hear us?
Oh, perfect. Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Thank you. That's awesome. That was really great timing. I was just getting back to see if you were back on, so fantastic. So we did get a question in the chat box, and it was while Meg was talking. And so, Meg, I'll address this question to you, and then Laura and Michael, if you have anything to add, you're welcome to do that. But the question was, why is back-end parking preferred over front-end parking?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this might be a better question for our engineers. But I will say this is a great way for us to be thinking about why inclusive walk audits are important. So this is something that Mark Clinton talks about a lot. It's meant to put people's eyes on traffic as they pull out into traffic. It's meant to create better, safer routes from the vehicles to the sidewalks. And so it's different. And so some of the tactical urbanism projects that people do give experience. They say try it out for a day. They'll set up back-in parking for a while and get people over the hump of doing it. But if you think about it from how we stripe for access aisles for vans, or how we think about how people connect to the accessible route to the sidewalk, it's different, right? So it's not just restriping and reprogramming the back-end parking when it comes to really making that inclusive option for folks. So when we've tested that with some of our partners who use accessible vans, you'll see that it's a little different. You have to think it through with that community. How will that option work in your community for everyone? And there's probably statistics on this that our folks at the Highway Research Center may have.
Yes, I did share a link to some information we have on back-in angle parking from PPIC. I'm not the engineer on our team, but I know that back-in angle parking, when designed correctly, can address some key safety and kind of movement challenges. So happy to talk more offline about that question as well.
Great, thank you so much. And for those on the phone and not in the webinar room, I will include the link that Laura provided in the email that I send out with the evaluation. So you'll get that as well for your resource if you want to take a look at that. All right, so we did get another email question that came in, and it was about lessons learned from the Helena audit. Can you talk about lessons learned and any takeaway recommendations?
So several have been done in Helena, and I would say some that stick out in my mind are, when you have that interdisciplinary approach and you're looking at the cost of steam-heated sidewalks. So some of those photos I showed where the sidewalks were covered in snow and the intersections were really problematic from the snow and the ice. There were some federal buildings on that route that use steam-heated sidewalks, and they are clear and dry as a bone. And when you think about the cost of a fall to a person, to their own freedom and to their health, and then think it all the way through to the third-party payers, and you put that into the conversation with the cost of those steam-heated sidewalks, we start to get kind of like, well, maybe it's a little more reasonable. And then we started to look at some of the literature, where I think there's a town in Michigan that invested in their downtowns as steam-heated sidewalks to compete with the mall and did so effectively. That really stuck out to me. That was a solution that someone on the walk really brought to snow management that was of interest to the disability community for sure. Some of the other things that have come up is, at the implementation level, when public works partners, some of those companies come in and do their work, even if the city like Helena has a complete streets resolution, even if that's in place, those partners may or may not restore. Every time you take down a curb cut or rebuilding the infrastructure, the pedestrian infrastructure, the active transportation infrastructure, you're supposed to be building it out to the complete streets guidelines. But there was a great example on that walk where it was restored as a curb and not a curb cut. And so you have this beautiful truncated dome, pro-ag design, curb cut on the other side of the intersection, but no access to it. So those were a couple of the lessons learned. I would say I've been working in this area for a while, and one of my key partners representing People First, which is a national advocacy organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that person did the short, Mike Shaw, who's a People First longtime member in Helena, he did the small section around the hotel, really looked at all the amenities that the hotel had, I think, mindfully designed to connect to, a carousel, a kids museum, some restaurants, and he was really able to think through the hassles, not just the significant barriers, but also some of the hassles, some of the easy fixes, some of the long-term fixes for increasing the accessibility of those routes and improving the access to those assets in that area. So I thought that was really important. Mike helped me really focus on that and worked with a couple of our Healthy Communities Coalition partners in Helena on that route and brought back a lot of useful information to the action planning session.
All right, great. Thank you so much. We do have one more question before we close for the day, and it's for Laura and Michael. Can you address the extent to which the disability community has been involved in AV research and the discussion, and then expand on any particular research focusing on the disability interaction issue?
Yeah, this is Michael. There is some, yes, there are different populations that are involved with some of that research. Unfortunately, it's still early days for that. I can call out a couple of examples. So Laura and a researcher from Virginia Tech's Transportation Institute, Justin Owens, organized a workshop at the recent Automated Vehicle Symposium in San Francisco. And there were actually a couple of workshops there devoted to people with disabilities and mobility issues. But at those, they were fairly well attended. There were a number of different stakeholders who were there. So there was some representation from paratransit. There was also some specific, very compelling research that was coming out of Norway on blind users. And so, for example, someone who is visually impaired really was more of a discussion about some of the research issues that still needed to be explored, and not so much about specific completed research topics. So, for example, it talked about what happens if somebody with a visual impairment, they're on this vehicle and they get dropped off on their block. How do they know, what their orientation is to their final destination? What if they're, 20 feet down the block versus right in front of the door, they're going to have to navigate to the exact entrance. And then there's also, at some point, if you're getting into or getting out of an autonomous vehicle, there's some point, albeit fairly short, where they're going to be stepping into traffic. And so there is some kind of a hazard involved there of how do you make that transaction safe. So, and then of course there are the assistance issues of, how do folks with various disabilities get in and out of vehicles. So anyway, there was a number of different issues. I think there are a number of examples of these populations being at the table, but the research is still, I would say, in its infancy at this point for some of the resolutions.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to what Michael said, so I've been involved with the automated vehicle breakout sessions that look at not only pedestrians, but we were trying to coordinate some of the other breakout sessions with other disability topics and sort of work in parallel. The other thing at TRV is there is a subcommittee now formed under the pedestrian as a parent committee to look at pedestrian and bicycle interaction with automated vehicles. And I will say we've had nice representation at those subcommittee meetings from people representing people with disabilities, particularly blind and visual impairment. And so I think those provide a forum for hearing about these issues, but we probably need to get more active in addressing the research more directly. NCHRP funds an automated research roadmap, and they do an update pretty regularly. The last I looked at that, they were recommending, I think it was around 25 different research projects, and only 3 of them seem to directly call attention to pedestrian issues. I think it would be useful to go back and look at AASHTO and NCHRP's research roadmap and identify explicit opportunities to better integrate people with disabilities into the research before it gets funded. And also for people who are interested and have a stake and need to be in a leadership role to be joining those panels. All of that NCHRP research is guided by panels made up of volunteers. So I think that's a really unique and important opportunity to help shape research that's coming out in this area.
Great, thank you. We do have one more question that came in while you were answering that one. We'll take that one. Don't like to leave questions on the table. So what are the complementary or synergistic opportunities available as AV sensory technology is placed in communities that benefit not only automated cars, but also people who have difficulty with wayfinding?
Wow.
Can you repeat that one more time while we digest?
Absolutely. It's in the chat section, so if it helps you to look at it, it is kind of a lengthy one. But it's what are the complementary or synergistic opportunities available as AV sensory technology is placed in communities that benefit not only automated cars, but also people who have difficulty with wayfinding?
So one of the opportunities here that is also being worked on is with V2X technology, so vehicle to pedestrian, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to device technology. So
because automated vehicles at all different levels do so much data processing, they also have the ability to communicate all these messages in a number of different ways. Whether it's through signage or through audio signals, but there's no reason why these same signals couldn't be done electronically. So if different people have various wearable devices, then there would certainly be an opportunity to have some kind of a customized wearable device that communicates a message in a way that makes sense for that particular individual. The same way that via the web, you have the data can be presented through text, through audio, and so forth, and translated. I would imagine that opportunity would still be present for wearable and portable devices as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So with that, we will go ahead and end the session for the day. Thank you so much to Meg and Laura and Michael for the great presentations. If you have questions that come to mind later, or if you just have a comment that you want to make, feel free to email that to the NADTC. We're happy to field those questions after the session as well. As I mentioned earlier, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation for today's webinar. I'm going to email that to everyone that registered here in just a moment, along with that link for the angled parking question that came up. So I'll go ahead and get that emailed to you in just a moment. But also keep in mind that you can contact the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center for a whole host of accessible transportation topics. And so you can do that via email at contact@nadtc.org. And as usual, check the NADTC website for upcoming events and additional resources. So thank you so much for your participation today, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.